Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, chapter 909 of One Piece is out. So if you haven't checked out that chapter yet, I suggest that you do so because I will be spoiling you. But now that you have, let's begin. So yeah guys, we finally made it to Wano. What is it, 3 years later? Jokes aside, I love the Reverie. And I'm hopeful that it's not over, although it very well could be. But if we're gonna come down from the greatest arc, whether it's, 3 chapters, whatever, the greatest arc in the history of One Piece, we might as well get into another arc that has been continually hyped up by everybody involved with One Piece. But yeah, I think the first thing that I want to address is the Reverie over or not? I know a lot of people will be upset or disappointed if the Reverie is over, but guys, I'm not saying it is because I don't know, but it absolutely could be, and it would make some sense. I think that it makes sense to off-screen the Reverie, potentially report the results after Wano. We could also get into certain events of the Reverie, sort of splashed into Wano. It kind of depends on whether or not Oda is doing this, based on actual timeline. Like, these events are going on at the exact same time, so as we see Wano now, the discussion during the Reverie is taking place, which means that there's several more days of the Reverie that need to pass. And if these days are going to pass during the Reverie, then they would also need to pass in Wano. I know a lot of people freak out when things are off-screen, but oftentimes this is done for a reason. And it's not something that particularly bothers me. A lot of the fights, like for instance seeing Green Bull fight the Revolutionaries or something like that, I think that Oda might want to save the reveal for Green Bull's powers to a moment in which it's very important to the Straw Hat's actual story and not a general story about the state of the world and various global changes. I'm not saying that Oda shouldn't tell us what these changes are, but he doesn't need to show us every single detail. Certain things like the Straw Hat, which we got recently, and Imu-sama. Those are things that at the time that we got them, I 100% expected them to be long-standing mysteries. They're not going to be addressed in just the next couple chapters. If you thought that it had to be the case, I really think that you might be a little impatient. It's like when the Poneglyphs are revealed. We didn't expect the time the Poneglyphs were revealed that, okay, well, this needs to be addressed in the next couple chapters. No, it's a long-standing mystery. It's something that will be explained at the end, and I expect the same will be true of the Straw Hat and this mysterious leader of the world government who rules from the shadows. Now, I'm not saying that it has to be revealed later. Again, we don't know if the Reverie is gonna kick off next chapter. Again, it's probably not, but I mean, it could be. And then something like that could be explained, but it doesn't have to be, and that is my point. As for major climactic fights that might actually occur during the Reverie, specifically with the actions of the Revolutionary Army, I think that probably your expectations are a bit out there if you thought that we are going to get a full battle. I mean, the editor even confirmed that the Reverie as an arc would not really be long enough to be considered an arc. Yet we all understand that there is enough taking place during it for it to be capable of that. It's just not something that seems like a direction Oda is going to go in. And I think that we should expect to see the Revolutionary Army fight at some point in time when these strats are actually present. At least that's my expectation. And the same goes for everybody important of any strength from the world government at the Reverie as well. So yeah, long story short guys, is that there could be splashes of the Reverie, updates on news, etc. throughout Wano, especially if there's several more days left of the Reverie and the Wano arc progresses over, again, several days. But I do think that there are people out there that need to temper their expectations for just how much detail of the Reverie we will get. The Reverie exists mainly as an info dump and allowing for great changes within the world that will vastly impact the future plot, which will eventually intertwine with the actions of the Straw Hats. Because I think that we need to be reminded and remember that this is not a story about the Revolutionary Army or a story of the kings of the world government or the world government itself. It's a story about Monkey D. Luffy and his pirate crew. Everything exists to support and enhance this journey. But yeah guys, let's talk about the actual events of this last chapter, which was almost exclusively focused around the events that will be soon taking place in Wano and Wano itself. We start off this chapter with a conversation between Marco the Phoenix as well as Nekomamushi. We learned a lot of little tidbits of information, but only a couple really stood out to me as vitally important information, aside from just general supporting information to better understand and appreciate Whitebeard, as well as Marco's powers. The first is that we learned that near 40 years ago, Bakken, the mother of Whitebeard Jr., Edward Weevil, was on the same crew as Whitebeard. And I just want to interject here, guys, 40 years ago, like for some reason, that particular time was incredibly important in One Piece. Seems like everybody's past ties to essentially 40 years ago when there was maybe a great change. We know or we assume that Big Mom and Kaido were on the same legendary pirate crew 40 years ago, when it can be assumed that the legendary pirate crew disbanded for one reason or another, and this same impression is given of Whitebeard and Bakken. And my first thought is that maybe this legendary pirate crew also included Whitebeard and Bakken. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward theory, right? This legendary crew disbanded 40 years ago, and Whitebeard and Bakken were last crewmates, essentially 40 years ago. I know that sounds crazy, right? You have potentially Big Mom, Kaido, and Whitebeard all on the same crew 40 years ago, but it just seems realistic to me. It seems very possible. Like, there was the greatest pirate that ever existed, just one pirate crew to rule them all 40 years ago. Maybe he didn't find Raftel, maybe he didn't search for the poneglyphs, maybe he didn't know how to read the poneglyphs, but as for actual combat and control over the new world, he had it all. And once that pirate crew disbanded, it allowed for the creation of many separate crews that went on to dominate the new world and split it into parts. But of course, this doesn't have to be the case, but I do suspect that there is at the very least some connection, like the defeat of this pirate crew had some effect on whatever crew Whitebeard and Bakken were previously a part of. Maybe, a lot of people interpret rocks to be an actual battle. Maybe the legendary pirate crew and Whitebeard's previous crew were a part of that battle and they both lost. Or maybe this is one of those great cleansings that the Gorosei seem to hint at might have occurred in the past, where Imu-sama or the world government decided that at this time 40 years ago they were going to try and eliminate all of the greatest pirates. So you have multiple great pirate crews disbanding at about the same time. And maybe from the experience of this event, the world government has become more cautious of doing the same thing again, because of the calamity or the destruction that was caused because of it or something. I don't know, there's a connection, I feel it. Another important clarification this chapter gave us was why certain countries are not a part of the world government. Now, this doesn't apply to all countries. For instance, Elbaf and Wano are incredibly strong nations that the world government might be, at least in part, fearful of. But for the majority of nations that are not part of the world government, the reason for this is because they are not wealthy enough to be able to pay the heavenly tax. And because they are not offered the protection of the world government, they essentially become lawless zones where criminals and slavers and all sorts of nasty people, pirates, can come in and do as they please. So the countries that are not wealthy enough to join the world government are essentially punished because of that. And I think that this adds a lot of importance onto the role the Yonko, specifically good Yonko like Whitebeard, Big Mom in my opinion, or Shanks play in the New World, where they have territory in which they protect regardless of tributes of gold. In the case of Big Mom, obviously she requires tributes of food, but at least for Shanks and Whitebeard, you can really understand how beneficial they are, how benevolent they are. If they weren't protecting their territory in the New World, these countries, some of these countries, specifically the ones that are not wealthy enough, would have a very hard time existing in peace. And of course, this furthers the argument that the world government are dicks because they just watch and let this happen. They look down on poor people. I just thought this was really interesting. This is not something that I knew before and was important world building to understanding how everything sort of works. But yeah, the last major reveal the beginning of this chapter gave us was whether or not Marco the Phoenix will be accompanying Nekomamushi to Wano, because it's essentially revealed, right, that Marco needs to protect this particular place because it's Whitebeard's last treasure. And if Marco is not there to protect it, bad things could potentially happen to it, whether it be the actions of Blackbeard or Edward Weevil. And so this is incredibly frustrating, and reminds us to, all of us really, to read the official translation if you have access to it, or buy the volumes later. But for the scanlation sites that translate the chapters early for us, there's two major ones. You have MangaStream and you have Jimini's Box, and they each translated Marco's future and fate exactly oppositely, leaving me very much unsure as to whether or not Marco is going to stay in that territory or come with Nekomamushi. I believe Jimini's Box translated that Marco was staying, and MangaStream translated that Marco was going to go with Nekomamushi. So I'm just going to be waiting for the official translation to find out, what the actual truth is. Because Marco coming to Wano is a big deal. On one hand, I think Marco should go because this feels like it feels unnecessary to come here if Marco was not going to leave with them. But the counter-argument to this is that this story exists to set up Edward Weevil's future actions and sort of build his resume if he attacks this place and defeats Marco for when Edward Weevil encounters the Straw Hats. And to go along with this, the actual context of the chapter leads me to believe that Marco is staying. But as I said, I am not sure, so I'll be looking forward to that clarification on Monday. But yeah, this leads us into Wano itself and the actions of the Straw Hats as well as Kinemon since they have arrived. And essentially, they have been trying to blend in while they gather the support and the resources necessary to be able to do something. Also, I think that it's important that they wait for everybody to arrive, including Nekomamushi as well as the rest of the Minks and Straw Hat Luffy and the remaining Straw Hat Pirates. But yeah, guys, Wano is absolutely gorgeous. It lived up to my expectations. I love everything about it. It's just, this is like, I absolutely love when Oda gives us new islands, new cultures, all of this. It really enhances my One Piece experience in ways that I just can't fully describe, but this is what I live for. And I don't even think we've gotten the full story about everything that could potentially, everything Wano could be like, I should say. But one thing I do want to point out to you is the presence of Sakura blossoms or cherry blossoms in Wano. This makes sense because Wano is Japan and cherry blossoms are a very important, I believe, cultural plant or tree for Japan. And I made a theory about this a long time ago and something that I still think is the case. Remember, Dr. Heeluk, who raised Chopper, talked about having found an island sometime in the past when he had some sort of incurable disease, and it was in fact the cherry blossoms which were the panacea or the cure-all which saved his life. And so now here we are in Wano and it's confirmed that it has cherry blossoms. It's very possible that Heeluk visited Wano in the past, and that this arc will become very critical to Chopper's story going forward. Specifically in his desire to achieve his dream of being able to cure any disease. If Heeluk is right and it was these cherry blossoms which saved him. But there's another thing that could potentially relate to this as well, and this was given to me by SSJ22 Terrace several weeks ago, and is becoming something that I think is entirely viable. We know that Big Mom is sick, right? And we suspect that cherry blossoms or Sakura might be some sort of panacea, or there might be an area in Wano which has healing properties. So, and we also know that Big Mom is heading to Wano. Wano could potentially cure Big Mom. That's just something I want to throw out there. It seems like a possibility. But yeah, I don't really want to get into the specifics of all the little things that we got to see in Wano with what the crew's doing. I think the only really important thing, aside from what is going on with Zoro, is that it appears as though Robin's goal is to be able to have a closer acquaintanceship with the Shogun of Wano. And the Shogun of Wano's name is Orochi, and as was pointed out to me by Revujo, Orochi in Japanese mythology was a many-headed snake. But the interesting connection that Revujo shared with me was that when Orochi was killed, inside of its body, one of its tails was a legendary sword called Kusanagi. And so perhaps this supports the idea that once the Shogun of Wano is defeated, Zoro will have obtained a new legendary sword. But I do think that it is interesting to point out, or maybe possibly important to point out, that even if this sword exists in One Piece does not mean that Zoro will use it, because typically this sword is ceremonial, even in classic Japan, even though the sword isn't actually confirmed to exist. The main thing about the sword is its supposed magical properties. I would need to read more about it to understand these specific magical properties, which could be interesting to talk about, but the original name of the Kusanagi was the Ame no Murakumo no Suguri, which translates as the Heavenly Sword of Gathering Clouds, which sounds pretty fucking badass. But yeah, anyway, moving on to what Zoro was doing in this chapter, we can see that he was framed by somebody who we can suppose wanted to obtain and notice that Zoro had the legendary sword of Wano, Shusui. However, Zoro, noticing that this guy was the actual culprit of the crimes he was being charged with, attacked him. Even though he was not supposed to, because they are supposed to remain inconspicuous. So I think the impression that we're supposed to have at the end of this chapter is all hell is just about to break loose. And while it's not necessarily Zoro's fault, it's kind of Zoro's fault. Although granted, if I really sit here and think about it, Zoro wasn't given much choice as soon as he was accused of murder. So here are my thoughts, guys. Zoro against all of Wano starting next chapter. That could definitely be the case. Zoro might need to go into hiding. As of right now, the rest of his crew is safe, but as soon as people realize that he is Zoro, although Wano is cut off from the world, so they may not be able to know that, or they may not know that, it's possible the Shogun has this kind of intel. They could hunt down the rest of the strats, they could look for them, they could be outed as well, and, you know, by the time the rest of the strats arrive, it could be a bad situation. But on the other hand, this is really what I want to talk about, because it isn't as what is being explicitly sort of given as an impression. It is also possible that Zoro is called a hero. If it can be proven that the guy that he slashed was in fact the murderer, and the people of Wano respect just how skilled Zoro is, even with a little tiny dagger. Which, as a brief side note, I think that was a callback all the way to Mihawk, and a representation of just how far Zoro has come as a swordsman. Because remember, in chapter 50 of One Piece, Mihawk almost mocks Zoro by using a little tiny dagger to fight him. Like, honestly, you know, a way to subvert our expectations here could be if the Shogun of Wano learns of what has occurred there and tries to recruit Zoro onto his team. That sounds kind of ridiculous maybe, but it seems entirely viable to me. It's like, bro, that dude is strong as hell, we need him on our squad. I mean, he killed a murderer, as well as he can't have been the one responsible for desecrating Ryuma's grave and stealing Shusui. Like, he might have the sword now, but his hands aren't dirty, because all of this stuff was stolen before he was even born. But I think that either way that you look at it, Zoro probably will not have Shusui for, you know, the next, you know, he won't be able to have Shusui for the future of Wano. It's quite possible Zoro is nerfed. Like, I know that a lot of people wouldn't want that, but it might be two-sword style Zoro for the remainder of Wano until he is able to obtain a new third sword, or reacquire Shusui. But yeah, guys, that's kind of where I'm sitting right now. Either all hell breaks loose in Wano for the Straw Hat Pirates, or Zoro is called a hero and recruited by important people in Wano, and they're actually a little bit closer to achieving their objectives, just by chance. But yeah, guys, I am so excited for Wano. I thought that this was a great chapter. I think that we need so much more world building with Wano, but this was an incredibly exciting start. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys have to say about this. If you noticed anything from the chapter that I may have missed, just share your thoughts. Like the video if you liked the video, dislike the video if you dislike the video. Make sure to subscribe if you want to be notified for my future content. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.